Okay, everyone, thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Brian Pagano, coming to you from California. What we want to talk about this morning is normally when we do an API event or when we have a conversation and a session like this, we tend to talk about the technical nuts and bolts of APIs, how to design them, how to secure them, how to scale them, all that kind of great stuff, really important stuff. But there's a bunch of things that we tend not to talk about, right? And so what we'd like to do this morning is talk about a few of those things because they're really, really important. And we kind of put them all under the umbrella of maybe we should stop thinking in terms of projects and start thinking more in terms of API products. Because APIs are big, APIs enable today's ecosystems, right? APIs are something that drives revenue for the company. And these are big topics, and yet we tend to think of it very operationally. So let's get down to basic ideas. We all know what a project is, right? A project is planned work with an end date. I don't think any of us would disagree with that, right? Now, project thinking tends to reward certain things. So I'd always tell my managers that you incent the kind of behavior that you want to have, right? And so project thinking incents what kind of behavior? It incents doing the minimum to meet the project requirements and not screwing up. The problem with this is that it tends to be very internally focused, right? It's not customer focused at all. It is not about interacting and iterating with a customer. It is about meeting those internal requirements, right? And so what does that incent? What kind of behavior do we get out of that? That's not even the biggest issue that I have with when I go out, and I'm not talking about you guys specifically, but when I go out and visit companies and they tell me, Brian, let's talk about our API project, I think, project that has an end date. What are you talking about, right? APIs drive mobile, they drive web, they drive IoT, right? There are all the apps and devices and all this kind of stuff. That's not going away. There's no end date on this stuff. So why would we try to put an expiration date on the APIs? I want to show you a picture of a potato. No, honestly, I didn't want to show you a picture of a potato. What I wanted to do was show you a picture, a screenshot from the movie Pulp Fiction. But sometimes when you work at a big company, people tell you, no, Brian, you absolutely can't do that. You cannot show a picture from Pulp Fiction. And what I wanted to say was, go ahead, I dare you, I double dare you, that iconic moment from the movie. And in this case, the question that I get first from when I visit your companies is, Brian, what's the biggest mistake that we're going to make with APIs? I mean, the fact that you're attending a session like this, the fact that you're reading up, that you're knowledgeable on the subject means you probably won't make the big mistakes. But the big mistake that most companies make is passing the hot potato, right? Is hearing, this API thing, okay, I see. Why don't you go talk to my director of operations, right? And we just talked about how APIs drive the customer experience, right? They drive the apps. They drive the fight against market share erosion, channels to market, against top line and bottom line revenue, things like that. Like, why would you pass that off to operations? Why? Because API inherently sounds geeky. I wish it was a different word. I wish it was a different term, because it does. It sounds incredibly geeky, and I'm speaking as a geek here. So if APIs are not a project, okay, Brian, I get it. Projects have an end date. Maybe we're using the wrong terminology. If APIs aren't a project, then what are they, right? Let's think about that, right? There's a couple of possibilities. So maybe APIs are a program, right? This is definitely a step better. This is a cluster of projects, right? This is thinking at least a little bit bigger, maybe across a department or a line of business. That's better. I would be less concerned if you said, Brian, I want to talk about our API program. And what about platforms, right? How does that fit in? That's a buzzword right now. Everyone's talking about platforms, thinking about platforms. I saw a graphic a couple of months ago when I was speaking at a fintech conference, and it showed the most valuable companies in the world from last year, and showed the most valuable companies in the world from like 15 years ago and 25 years ago. And 25 years ago was all the companies you'd expect, manufacturing companies, petroleum companies, all those kind of things. And the list from last year was Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, you know the list. And people always say, "Oh, Brian, I get it. I understand. It's Silicon Valley companies." Wrong. I mean, they are kind of Silicon Valley companies, but there are a lot of Silicon Valley companies that aren't on that list. Okay, Brian, I get it. They're all software companies. Wrong. I mean, yeah, they are all software companies. There are a lot of software companies not on that list. If you look at the list of the most valuable companies in the world right now, they all have something in common, and that is that they are platforms. What does that mean? That means that they allow others outside of organizational trust boundaries to participate in their success. Right? When they've tied their success to other people's success and vice versa. That's how you get the platform multipliers. That's how you get the big platform economics that we all hear about. And I'm going to propose that there's a third possibility beyond program and platform, that APIs may just be kind of the way of life for the upcoming years or decades of a company. In which case, now this may seem semantic, right? This may seem, okay, Brian, so we'll give it a different label and everything's the same. But it's this mindset shift, right? Because you're going to make decisions differently if you think something has an end date versus if you think this is going to be simply the way you do business. Because let's be honest, in 2018, your API is your open for business sign. It's that important. Why? APIs power customer experience. The big weakness I see amongst most of the big, mighty, traditional companies right now is they kind of stink at customer experience. They have mistaken mobile as being little web. Right? They've mistaken web as being a sort of modern version of a mainframe terminal. Right? They're really not good at the experience part. They might be great at the scalability part or the security part or some of the other things, the logistics part. But they tend not to be great at customer experience. And customer experience is the predominant challenge of today. And APIs power customer experience. APIs help your company move faster. It's what I tell every new employee over here. The big reason why people use APIs, the big reason why people use an API platform is simply velocity. It's the only way to survive in today's platform economy, app economy, is to use APIs and get the speed that you could not possibly get with rip and replace, with the traditional SDLC, with trying to hire your way out of things. Okay, so if we're talking customer experience, and we're talking revenue, we're talking market share, we're talking all these things, that doesn't sound as geeky anymore. The term itself hasn't changed, but it doesn't sound so geeky. These are the kind of things that, I know we have a mixed audience. Some folks are more from the business side, some are more from the technical side. If you're more from the business side, this should get your attention. Oh, now I see why everybody is asking to fund this stuff. This is really important. This is actually the core of our business strategy, of our survival and our thriving strategy over the next couple of years. And if you're on the technical side, this is the ammo that you need to talk to the people on the business side to explain, okay, so this isn't just about security. This isn't just about scalability, reliability, all those kind of things. This is about some key aspects of the business. Now, logic and philosophy happen to be kind of a hobby of mine, and I really love this tool called the category mistake. Right? And a category mistake was started by the philosopher Gilbert Ryle in the 20th century, and he brought, I can never remember if he was Oxford or Cambridge. For some reason in my mind, those are just the same thing. And he brought his friend to visit, let's call it Cambridge. He brought his friend to Cambridge and said, I'm going to show you around Cambridge, and took him to the dining hall and to the lecture hall and to the dormitory and said, how do you like everything? And his friend said, that's great. Where's Cambridge? So his friend had made what Gilbert called a category mistake. He had mistaken Cambridge to be a type of building, when Cambridge was a type of university, which is a meta category over that. And we tend to make these category mistakes all the time, where we think something of category A is really category B. And this can be very dangerous because it's not just a semantic labeling. It means you're going to make every decision from that point cascadingly off target. And the differential is going to get farther and farther and farther, right? So it is a category mistake to mislabel core business level tools like APIs as an operational issue. right? And I jokingly sometimes say, well, that would be like saying that your company's revenue calculation is predominantly a pencil sharpening issue. Like your company's revenue is going to be really based on how sharp that pencil is or not. Nah, you might need a pencil. There might be an operational aspect to how you calculate or report your company's revenue, but ultimately revenue is something far more important than the pencil. So how does this happen? I talk to a lot of companies, a lot of your companies out there, and there's a lot of smart people. So how do we get into this situation? Well, for one thing, as we mentioned, APIs sound geeky. It just is inherently a geeky term. But there's another reason, and that's because every organization has blind spots, right? So when I was working in New York as a technology executive, I would have people come to me in the morning and say, Brian, that guy's being a jerk. I'd say, I don't think so. I can't believe you came into my office to say that. I don't think anybody woke up, looked at themselves in the mirror this morning and said, you know what? I'm going to be a jerk today. Right? I just don't believe it. I think that people misunderstand their mandate. People have incomplete information, right? People have blind spots because they're not communicating correctly. Every time I walk into a room with a COO or a CMO, somebody on the business side, the first thing they tell me is, Brian, my IT department is broken. They're expensive, they're slow, they just can't get anything done. And the first thing that happens when I get in the room with a CTO, a CIO, is they say, the business is crazy. They're asking us to release things faster than we've ever released onto multiple platforms. We're not set up for that. That's not our charter, right? And so what you have is this chasm between two highly intelligent, competent groups of people. I don't believe either of them are broken. I don't believe either of them are crazy. You've got two competent groups of people who both want to do the right thing, and yet we end up in the situation we're all in today, which is we're not delighting the customer. It is taking us far too long to prototype and bring things to market. We are having trouble going to market across budget codes and departments and lines of business. Why is it? Why are we having so much trouble? All right, I know I'm sounding like doom and gloom, right? And I don't mean to, though the stakes are extremely high. The stakes are existential right now. If you do not become API first, if you do not at least participate in some kind of platform or ecosystem in the next 2 years, you will cease to do business in the way you are doing business right now. And whether that's bankruptcy or buyout or merger or disruption from a digital competitor or a traditional competitor, I can't predict the future any better than anybody else, or I'd just still be on Wall Street investing. But the fact is that this is an existential battle. It's that important, right? And whenever I talk to a customer that says, "Well, Brian, this all sounds great, but I didn't really have this budgeted this year. Like I don't really know what to do with APIs," and I'd say, we both agree that this is about customer experience. This is about your developer ecosystem, your partner ecosystem, right? This is about your cross-departmental go-to-market. This is about visibility, monetization. This is about scale and security in your company's reputation. What is it that you're funding? Like, what is it that seems more important than this kind of stuff? And so the good news is that I say, okay, Brian, so how do I break this down? That's a lot of stuff to think about. How do I break this down? One methodology that I use is simply to start identifying just a couple of things. Right? What is the problem domain I'm trying to solve for here? And who are the participants? Right? Who's involved in that domain? And the problem domain is one of the most mistaken parts of this. People start talking to me about, well, we need a website for developers. Of course you need a website for developers, right? That's necessary. But it's not sufficient. What happens when those developers start building things? Right? Aren't you going to have traffic? Don't you need security and monetization, all these other bits? Or somebody says, well, I've got a runtime gateway. I've got bits and pieces. That's great. You need to have that. You need to be able to have a high throughput, low latency, secure, scalable runtime gateway. That's necessary, but it's not sufficient. Right? I think we'd all agree that if you can't get from the stuff that you've built and bought over the last 40 years and get it out into the hands of a user, whether that happens to be a customer, like pictured here, or a point of sale employee, or an internal employee, or a partner, or whomever. If you can't get from point A to point B, you simply have not solved the problem. And I don't know why so many companies focus on 1/6 of the problem. Once we've understood this problem domain, who participates, right? Who are the agents, the players, whatever kind of term you want to use. There are indeed a lot of tech players. And I know I've been saying, stop thinking of this as technology. What I mean is stop thinking about this as purely technology. It is obviously technology. There's obviously a technology and operational component, right? So there are the usual suspects. But at the same time, there are a lot of business players. Right? And I think we tend to forget that if we're talking about customer experience, if we're talking about ways to go to market, maybe new subscription opportunities or new ways to monetize or combine certain products or go to market with partners, I mean, that has business written all over it. Right? Both of these groups should be involved. And another way to look at it would be to say, well, there's the lines of business, and where I see most companies stumbling, they're talking to me about omni-channel all the time, but they're just multi-channel. They're just multi-channel saying the word omni-channel because they're not operating at the brand level. Because the only way to operate at the brand level is to put a facade down in front of all those little silos we've built, all those budget codes, all the things that have happened from mergers and acquisitions. We need to put down an API in front of all that stuff and start operating as a brand, and very few companies are operating that way today. So APIs are going to be part of how we're doing business, at least for the near future. Right? And I would say, I would be thinking in terms of decade to 2 decades at least here. So what do we need to think about? Well, one of the things coming from traditional Fortune 500 companies like I do is the governance process is generally set up for a different paradigm. It's generally set up for older style interactions that have lots of contracts and negotiation, and quite simply APIs don't have that kind of encumbrance. APIs, it's not to say that APIs don't need any governance, but APIs need a lot less governance, right? Then there's the question of who's going to fund things. This goes all the way back to the client server stuff, or when we had services, well, who's going to pay for the service? The team that builds it or the team that needs it, the team that consumes it? And this kind of conversation definitely continues with APIs. The difference, and the thing that people tend to mistake all the time with APIs, is that we tend to have this muscle memory of thinking about the back-end systems, which are heavyweight. Right? If somebody's going to build and maintain a service, like a macro service on the back end, that is a significant project and a significant investment. And if somebody's going to build and maintain an API on the front end of a facade, that is cheap, that is lightweight, that is inexpensive. And I get questions all the time from companies saying, well, Brian, how can I put more governance in? How can I put more structure in to prevent having duplicate APIs, having multiple APIs, replication? And I'm thinking, why do you care? I agree that you don't want replicated or duplicated back-end systems or macro services. That would be terrible. That would be very expensive, and they would be out of sync, out of date. Somebody would be stale. You wouldn't have single sources of truth. But why would you care about facades? They cost almost nothing. They are lightweight. Just let people have the facades they want. Right? And then there's the commercial models. Everybody who comes to me and says, Brian, I know how to make money from APIs, generally knows the one way that they know. And whether that's ad-supported or revenue share or subscription models or whatever, there's a good dozen solid ways to make money from APIs. Most companies only explore one. That's a huge mistake because APIs now open up a lot of different avenues to market, a lot of different channels for delivery, a lot of delivery of digital content. There's a lot of things you can do to make money, and people tend to paint themselves into one little corner. Ultimately, APIs are a forcing function. I've seen this time and again at companies who think that they're just buying another enterprise technology. Right? They're just buying another thing for another widget for their ecosystem. And what I found is this is the forcing function, right? This is kind of a turning point for a company to see whether they can get the mindset shift. Right? Whether they can not just implement this technology, the technology is not that hard to implement. It's whether they can start thinking API first. Right? It's whether they can start thinking outside in. What does the consumer of this API need? Whether that's a developer, a partner, or a customer, like what does the consumer need here? Right? Instead of thinking of what do we have, what can we offer, let's just kitchen sink this. Right? APIs tend to be that forcing function of can the different budget codes work together? Can you develop a partner ecosystem? Can you compete? Can you survive and possibly even thrive in this app economy, platform ecosystem economy that we have in 2018? So that's all great, Brian, but that's like saying do better. That's like the worst possible performance review you could get from your boss, right? Do better. That's so vague, there's nothing to do with it. So how do we start? Even after all I've said so far this morning, it is okay to start with a single API. If you have a current project, it's a funded project, it's an important project that's going through your portfolio right now, it's okay to start with that. The mistake is thinking that that is your API project. And APIs are a project and will end. But if you've got funding, if you've got something going, sure. The mistake I think people make is, like when we work with retail companies, is, well, we'll do the store locator API. Sure, it's important, it's a nice to have, but the thing is if that fails, you don't go out of business, right? It's not critical enough, and so you're not going to make the pivot. That's just going to be a technology project. You're not going to make the pivot. You're not going to be a platform. You're not going to be participating in ecosystems. You're not going to be API first that way, right? Now, after all I've said about operations, of course there will be an operational aspect. These things have to be available all the time. They have to be secure. They have to be scalable. You need lots of analytics and visibility. You're probably going to need regulatory and audit and all that kind of stuff, okay? And people ask me as I fly around the world, right? I get to meet lots of great folks all over the earth. And they say, what is it about Silicon Valley that seems so different? Right? You get all these giant companies, all these super successful, fast-moving companies. And as someone who's worked in New York, as someone who's worked in Europe, I can say that the big difference with Silicon Valley is that it's okay to fail. Right? I often felt in New York that if I tried a big, risky project that might have big payoffs for the company, that if at any point it looked like that project was not going to be viable, then that really could have damaged my career. I would have lost a lot of credibility. It would have been harder to get funding for the next thing. But in Silicon Valley, failure is it's assumed that that's going to happen, that very few things will succeed on the first iteration, that actually the faster you fail, the better. Failure gives tons of information. Right? And so when people say, well, we got to get our API perfect, so we've been designing it for 6 months and then we're going to take another 6 months. No, because your API won't be perfect. APIs are not a permanent thing. They're transient. They shift with the different presentation tier technologies, with the different customer segments. It's never going to be permanent. It's never going to be perfect. The best thing to do is get something out there and start iterating. Now, many of you folks answered a couple questions that we asked before the session. And it's interesting to take a look at the answers that we're getting at there. The big pattern that we're noticing, and there's, if you come to our sites, we can dig into this a little more, but the big pattern is that folks like you who are attending sessions like this, who are reading up, who are either thinking about buying and implementing this technology or have already started, tend to have the right vision. Meaning you tend to be saying the right vocabulary words. You tend to be thinking a little bit bigger picture, right? But we tend to see the wrong execution. So even though the correct words are being said, and there's some grandiose plans that actually look pretty good, what we're finding is there's this muscle memory to still confuse integration with APIs, for example. Integration connects system A to system B. API is a consumption layer in the architecture, which is a layer in front of that. It's a different layer of the architecture. It's a different thing, but people tend to confuse that and still act as though it's an integration play, right? People tend to still treat it like a technology and not get the executive support. And I know, I'm a lifelong technologist myself, that you think, oh, if I go to the business, they're going to ask, why are we spending this money, and blah, blah, blah. But the fact is that this is a hugely business impacting technology. In fact, in all my years of technology, I can't think of a single place where technology and business overlapped so much. And so if you don't have that executive support, which only 27% of you do, that's really setting yourself up for failure, right? And then the other thing is self-service. It's 2018. You're all doing business in 2018. Every vertical, every region. That means that all of your users, employees, partners, customers are expecting self-service. And yet so few companies, 36% of the already filtered group who are leaning forward. Of the leaning forward companies, only 36% are doing self-service. That is a huge mistake, right? Think about how you can do some more self-service. Every time somebody says to me, well, we're already exposing some APIs, we're already exposing some stuff, I just want to scream that this is about consumption. This is not about exposure. Nobody ever made $1 exposing complicated things. Taking complicated things, moving them closer to the customer, moving them forward in the architecture, just solves no problems. Right? This is about consumption. This is about getting developers in different lines of business consuming these APIs and building fantastic apps, web, mobile, IoT. This is about having partners get on board with your self-service API platform and start consuming the APIs. This is about your customers using all these great apps, web apps, mobile apps, and consuming them and sending transactions through your system. It is not an exposure problem. One of the things we've been saying for years at Apogee is that developers are the kingmakers. So companies, even the companies who have the executive sponsorship on the business side, they have the executive sponsorship on the technology side, they tend to forget about the developers because APIs are essentially invisible. It's just another technology in your ecosystem unless some developer, whether internal, badged employee, contractor, partner, third party, builds fantastic apps against the API. And I can't tell you how many companies lose focus on the fact that it's all about the developers building those killer apps. Now, I said just get started. It's a very different mindset, and I get that as someone who's been in technology for a long time. When you're doing these 18-month, 24-month, multi-million-dollar projects, it's like a giant train going down the tracks. It's hard to believe that just building a minimum viable product, right, almost like a prototype, is possibly a reasonable, responsible way to go. But I know that more and more of you are starting to switch over to different methodologies, agile methodologies, and things like that. And I just want to point out that minimum viable is still viable. Meaning, if you're saying, well, Brian, I've got a single button on the screen, that people push and nothing happens, that's not minimum viable. That's nothing, right? But if you've got the core interaction between your user and your business and your product down, and you've got the minimum functionality to support that, why not get that rolling? Because no matter how many smart people you have in a conference room, at a whiteboard, there are more smart people outside the room, right? And so the best way to find out how good an API is that people start using the API. And the best way to know how your customers feel about what you're doing is to have your customers use your stuff, right? And if I leave you with any ideas today about, the grab bag of topics we're talking about that's the non-technical nuts and bolts, is that it really comes down to speed. It's how can you prototype faster? How can you move through governance faster? How can you fund things faster? How can you get ideas into production faster? How can you get developers up to speed faster? How can you get new partners on board and up to speed faster, right? How can you make it look to your customers like you care about them, like you care about the latest devices and the latest technology, and you want them to have a great experience? You can't do it by ripping and replacing all the stuff you've got. You can't do it by hiring your way out of it like we've always tried to do for the last 50 years. The only way you can get that speed is to drop a facade in, drop an API. And the other thing is user experience. I just want to scream at companies right now, it's just all about user experience, right? Because we've been working the last 15, 20 years on security. We've been working the last 15, 20 years on scale. These things are all important. The need for those things hasn't gone away. What's new is this relentless demand by users on having a great experience. And companies just are having trouble making that shift. Now, we've got some more resources for you. So if you want to, obviously, when we go through this kind of thing verbally on a quick session, there's only so much we can cover. But there's a great ebook that's available to you with a link on the screen that you can dig in a little bit deeper. And we've got a whole microsite. We've got a whole site set up to talk about customer stories and all kinds of great resources for you to dig into. And of course, we're always happy if you reach out to us to talk a little bit. Now, there's just a couple minutes. I know we're running a little bit late. I'm going to quickly look through the questions. I see a bunch of you have commented on things. And yes, the slides and the material will be available. I see some of you were nodding along the way. Sorry, I couldn't look at both screens at the same time. I appreciate the solidarity, folks. A lot of people were saying, that I was saying truth, that there was a lot of the things you guys are dealing with on the day-to-day, and we tend not to talk about. So, some people have said there's been a lot of investment so far, especially financial services and others. There's been a lot of investment. Essentially, people have used some vendor-supported software to put UIs or presentation tier directly hitting some of these systems that companies have been investing in. They're very static. as the person commented, and in my mind, architecture tends to be a bit of a gray area. And whenever the more static something is, that tends to be behind the API layer. And the more dynamic something is, the more that tends to be at the API layer. And I would always suggest decoupling consumption tier, like presentation tier, from systems of record. Right? How people interact with data versus how data is stored and manipulated should never be directly connected. And so I get why some people use these technologies. I've used them myself in the past because it's a fast road to get from a mainframe to some kind of minimal web app or something like that. But I think we all know that ultimately that's not the way to go, that the API layer should be in between those things. Now, I'm not saying you can't use the same UI builder or whatever. You can still use some of these tools. I'm not saying you should change the back end, but you should definitely mediate this stuff with the API layer. Yeah, and so there were some questions specifically around Apogee, and I really appreciate that. During this kind of session, I really try not to make it sound like a commercial. Hopefully we succeeded in that. I'm trying to talk about APIs in general and API management in general. Obviously, we'd be really happy to dig in and talk about how Apogee specifically allows for rapid prototyping, self-service, rapid publishing of APIs, locking them down, scaling them out, monetizing them, all that kind of stuff. We would definitely be happy to do that offline or in some of the subsequent sessions that are a little more technical and detail focused. And some people ask if they want to go a little deeper. We do have a more thorough set of survey questions at our Compass tool, right? That's compass.apogee.com, which will allow you to take the complete digital maturity check and gauge how you guys are doing. Again, we're pretty much out of time. I really appreciate all the questions. Any ones that we didn't get to, we'll try to reach out to you, or feel free to ping us. We're always happy to talk about this. Just a reminder, there's the microsite, there's the ebooks, there's another webcast coming up on June 7th, and there's a virtual API jam, which is more of a hands-on, because again, it's always difficult with an audience like this where we have folks from both sides. Some of you are chomping at the bit to get your hands on it. That session is coming, and we've got some other great topics lined up for you. So I know this was a little goofy. This is a little bit different than the normal topics we talk about, but hopefully we address some of the things that we tend to just kind of brush past, not think about, but we all know is lurking in the corner of the room. I know I get really excited about this topic, and I was really glad to be able to share some of my experience with you this morning. Hopefully it was somewhat useful, gives you some ammo to take back to some of your colleagues, because I know most of you listening get it already, but you have to convince some of your colleagues, and hopefully we've helped you to do that. Thank you so much for spending part of your day with us, and I look forward to seeing you on future broadcasts.